Squamscott Road, we had Arnold Whitaker, where Crestview is, which was the Whitaker farm, and I have his daughter Lynn with me tonight. And then I will just go down Squamscott Road, and you came to Earl Wiggin, and that was the farm there, who I spent many years there. And across from Lorraine and Jim's farm in Lorraine was Ben Devine lived there, and he lived to be 90. And he told me so many stories, and he was the one that said there were 5 barns with our house where they had the horses. And the field has always been farmed since 1600. It was an Indian camp years ago, he said. And there was a mound down there where he said it was over the marsh where the Indians would shoot ducks. And we have found many articles out in our field. And maybe Lynn will say a word or two about her farm, but Stratham's just a wonderful town, and it's grown so much. And Lorraine, the Merrills, and myself, I keep saying we hold down the north end of town.
That's true. Thank you, Flossie. In our end of town too, also were the Wentworths, the Cody family, Rose Cody, right? Wentworth. I know I got some of my oral history from Franny.
Right.
And telling about.
They all lived in our house, caretakers. Can I say one? I have to tell you a little story. We were very, very friendly. My in-laws were the Roby Jewel, and we used to play cards. And we were over there one night, my husband and I, in the 70s, in Lucy's kitchen playing cards, and all of a sudden a car came in the yard. And he said, "Come on, Stubby, we got to go down the barn. Somebody's here, and we've got to go down the barn." Well, they were gone for a while and came back. They were both laughing. And I said, "What are you laughing at?" Well, this man had come from Epping with a cow. Now, this is in the 70s. They had brought it in the car. They had taken the back seat out of the car. The cow's head out one end, the tail out the other end, came right through Exeter with it. And he was to sell the cow, but I just had to tell him.
We had a number of trips where my parents bringing 4-H calves back in the back seat of our family car, but Doug had something on the show.
I have several stories I wanted to mention that I've written down. The barn where we live in the 19 to 37 was called the Holmes Farm, and it was a chicken farm. There were 5 floors of chickens in our barn at one point. Out back, we have a little house that little building we fixed up, and we rent it now, but that was a hatchery. Outside there's a cement farm. They used to put the coal in there. There's a big shovel hole in the bottom, and there's a chimney in there, which we use now to heat that building. So it was a big chicken farm. I know Stella had a picture of that. Yeah, it's over there. You can go and see it. It says Holmes Farm, little chicks, and so that certainly was diversity, and that certainly goes along with the fact that there were more chickens in the county than any place else. When I was a boy, there were Black Angus on that farm. I remember this white cow had a black calf one day. Uh-oh. And then went on, and there were Hereford's there. The person we bought the farm from had a lot of horses. He had the world champion pulling horses, which he used to have there, and many, many horses around there. So certainly, I probably should have mentioned that earlier, but my grandfather peddled milk and vegetables in Newmarket, and he was always very proud. He said there was a lot of poor people in Newmarket, but he never sold a cup of milk or a vegetable but what they paid him. They were mill workers, and they were very proud to pay their bills, and they did pay their bills. I also want to briefly mention, when my father was 14, he had his first cow. And you can know about what time it was because of the, in history, because that's when they were building the road. The CCC group was building what's Route 33 now, and he'd milk the cow in the morning. He put the milk in a wheelbarrow, and he took it down by fridges down into Greenland at the end of the road, and sold the milk to the people working there as they ate their lunch. So we've come a long ways from that activity. I'm going to tell a little risque story about Annie Wiggin scamming, and I hope her relatives who are sitting here don't mind me saying that story. Annie Wiggin scamming, her family was the one that the Wiggin Library was named after, and she was very active in many ways other than riding the horse racing home from church too. When I was, 13 years old, she wanted a quart of blueberries. So I went down the woods and picked her a beautiful quart of blueberries. I took it up and she gave me the 50 cents, and we kept talking. And talking about car rides. She says, the first car I ever rode in had no top on. She said, I got out riding, and it started raining. So the driver and I got under that car, and she said, what a good time we had under that car. I was a young boy, and he was very elderly at the time. That embarrassed me almost. I want to just say one thing about the Hubbards and their egg money. The Hubbards really made a lot of money doing their eggs. The older brother, that I think has finally died, but he had left in his will that he would give a lot of money to alcohol treatment in New Hampshire. So it was about 94, and they went over and said, how about if you give us some now, and then you can see how the stuff works. And he did, and I think he gave about $50 million. It's in a trust fund at the charitable trust fund, strictly for alcohol and treatment. And they certainly developed a lot of ways to treat alcohol, and it was his generosity and money that made that happen. Jim Scammon was my cousin. He worked very hard when he was young, and I have to say my Uncle Irvin would go peddle milk in Portsmouth, and sometimes he didn't get home till late in the day because he's spending the money down there having a good time. When Jim was 4 or 5 years old, he would milk all the cows by himself at night. And so he learned to work, and he was a heck of a worker. I mean, the coal farm right over here was the chicken farm that he worked at. And I guess the one last thing I wanted to say is a story about my father. When they mentioned someone from away, like John Hutton said he'll always feel like he's from away. My father moved to Stratham when he was 4 or 5 years old, and in 1943 he ran for the legislature. So old man Emery up here, he ran a vegetable stand and a vegetable farm. It was Fred Emery, he was a member of the state senate at one time, and every speech Fred Emery gave in the Senate was written in poetry. But anyways, he asked someone, who's running for the legislature? They said, oh, Doug Scammon. Oh, that guy that moved in over on the other side of town. There are a lot of great ties, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug. Georgiana, too, has some more.
I wanted to say when Doug said about his grandfather taking vegetables to Newmarket, I remember as a small kid riding with my grandfather and aunt to Newmarket to sell corn on a warm summer night, we would go over there at no particular night. It could be Tuesday night, Thursday night, or Friday night, and take over whatever corn he had extra that he wanted to sell. And that was back, and as I think of it nowadays, and I think of it often, people would sit out on their front porch. No TVs, no good on a warm summer night. That's what you did. Went out and sat on the steps of the front porch, and we'd just go by and then stop, and people would come to the car and buy whatever corn they wanted. I think he probably sold it like 25 cents a dozen or something like that. And he would sell all the corn that he could take over there. And one other thing I wanted to mention was that the barn to my place now was built in 1902 because 2 barns previously burnt by lightning. And this is the 3rd barn to my place, and it was attached to the house in 1902. I have a bill today for what it costs to build that house, plus build the barn, plus the shed that was attached to it, to the house. The barn is 40 by 60, 3 stories, and it still has the fork in it that Doug was talking about that emptied the, that we used to use from the loose hay, and it's still in my barn, and I used to remember too riding the horse to empty the fork when we pulled it down and ride it back to the barn. But I have a bill for that barn being built in 1902. As I say, it's a 40 by 60 barn, and with the L, and it also had an open shed, and the bill was $1,600. It was built by farmers, not contractors. And the bill on it was for building the barn, somebody's name, and my father and grandfather had to pay back by working either 2 hours with a team of horses, or a couple bushels of potatoes, or so many dozen of eggs, and that's the way the barn was paid for.
Thank you. Who else? Oh, Bambi?
Yeah, I just have a
Go ahead.
question.
I'll bring you the microphone. Before I do, I just wanted to point out that we do have a picture of Annie Scanlon with her favorite horse up here.
Introduce yourself.
Name is Bambi Miller, and I'm from Stratham County, and so I've come over, live in Lee, and I'm the district manager of the Conservation District. But my interest is, you've touched on, some of you went to markets in Portsmouth, and some of you mentioned Newmarket a couple times. Can you talk about where your markets changed and where you were selling your product? I'd be really interested in how that changed, or how far you went through the years, you know, how it changed where you sold it.
You know, that's a really good question, Bambi. And when you read, again, Samuel Lane's diary, they were shipping food products and wool products and so forth and selling them out of Portsmouth on ships, you know, in the 1700s. Stratham, I think we've been a crossroads. We're a transportation point as well as having all this good farmland. So we've had access to markets, and it's evolved a great deal. And I think it's been multiple markets through history. We were part of the Boston milk market. We more fluid milk sales here, and still today, the milk that gets produced here is used for fluid purposes because we're so close to the big urban population centers. And you think of the Wigan farm, that beautiful big vegetable farm off Bunker Hill Avenue, and Bob and Bertha owned, it was Portsmouth Produce Company, right? They called their business, and were marketing vegetables out of Portsmouth, but to, you know, that was before we got rid of our local food system. They, you know, were delivering to stores and school cafeterias, and people were actually getting local vegetables even in that kind of a distribution system. So there are many local markets. I mentioned the Baker farm was selling their milk into Exeter particularly, but a wider area as well. And I'll let you guys want to take that into it.
I just say 2 or 3 things. Lorraine mentioned the Wigan farm over there on the Bunker Hill Avenue. I think Bob started trucking produce to Boston every morning in the summers. But he had quite a vegetable farm for that time, and he'd go in and he'd bring back whatever products he needed to put into his, Portsmouth produce. I'd make one observation. On our farm where we live now, all the land along the river from River Road over was owned by our farm. And in the 1900s, maybe the 1800s, they sold off all that backland except for one narrow strip. And that narrow strip is kind of like an inlet, and they kept it open so they could take the product down and put it on the barges. It would be going to Portsmouth or to Exeter. So certainly that was part of the network. I think that mostly by the time in the 40s, most of the milk produced when left the farms in jugs. I mean, we always had people who would come and buy a gallon, a couple gallons of raw milk, and we get quite a bit more for it. Not a lot, but and they bought it for quite a bit less than what they would have to pay in the store, and quite frankly, it was more healthy for them because it was real milk. I think that it certainly has changed, and now you get more and more people buying the product directly from the farm, coming and picking it up, and I think you probably see it go that way more than it is now, even. But I think that by the time you got to the 40s, most of the milk was being shipped in jugs. Even before that, there used to be a stop on, I think it was on Post Road in Greenland. The railroad goes through there. Farmers used to bring their milk down there with their jugs, and the train would stop and take it to Boston. And that's why the jugs were about the size they were, because they could pick them up and move them. I don't know that I can offer much more than that.
Another question or another story, recollection? Oh, you got lots of them here.
Uh-oh. Where am I going?
There you go. Raise your hand.
Raise your hands again.
Is this on? Pete Wiggin. A couple of things come to mind that I wanted to mention. I'm a student of 17th century history, and the first mention of a farm in town is back in 1639, and that was when Wheelwright was settling in Exeter, and there was concern about establishing the boundary between the Squamscott patent and the town of Exeter. And one of the references to Captain Wiggins' farm at Squamscott down on the river. And that land area today would be Flossie Wiggins' farm and the Stuart farm. So we have a reference to the first farm in town, the land still being farmed today, and it's under conservation easement and preservation for future generations. And I think that's kind of a really neat thing. And the other one that comes to mind is in 1700, there's a Thomas Wiggin living at Sandy Point, and the inventory of his estate, it references the orchards that are east of the buildings. And east of those buildings would put it, orchard obviously is probably apples and pears and that type of thing, as early as 1700. And that would have been land that extended over into Greenland. And those apple orchards, I believe, probably evolved into, was that the Gowans in Greenland or the Brackets? The huge apple orchards over there. So very early history of farming in town. My grandfather, Ernest, Flossie had mentioned, owned the farm across from Stratham Hill Park, and that was purchased in 1931, and I looked at the copy of the deed this morning. He bought it for $1. It was 79 acres, and he had dairy cows and the like. And not only did he farm that 79 acres, but they also leased the land from the Hatch Farm, and that was a farm that is today Tidewater Estates. So they used to farm everything from Stratham Hill all the way down to Great Bay. And kind of a neat little bit of history. My history with farming, there isn't one. I grew up in the first state-of-the-art premier subdivision in town, Crestfield. And the split-level home at the time, in the 1960s, was the state-of-the-art avant-garde way to live. I remember the B-52s flying overhead from Pease Air Base. Crestview was a byproduct of that. I can remember as a kid the Whitaker farm, and in the 1970s the house sold, and I can remember going into the barns and still seeing the old incubators, the old mahogany incubators in there. One of the last chicken farms in town, Waldo Butterfield, down behind what's today the Sweet Dreams Bakery. There was a building down there that was 3 stories. And again, in the 1970s, I can remember Waldo also had a restaurant, the Weather Vane Restaurant, which is now the ice cream shop. And on Sunday morning,